Back in June, I had posted a video blasting Gran Turismo 7's campaign mode and progression systems. I said that Gran Turismo 7 represents an extreme example of all the things that made me stop playing Gran Turismo years ago. None of that has changed. Polyphony finally added the ability to sell unwanted or duplicate cars, and there's a handful of extra bonus menu collections for players to pursue after completing the main campaign. The actual campaign, however, and its underlying reward and progression systems remain unchanged from when I complained about them back in the summer. But I had also mentioned in that video, as a small aside, that the actual racing in Gran Turismo 7 is amazing. I thought that I would quickly lose interest in Gran Turismo 7 after I published my review and that critique video back in June, and that I would probably never pick up the game again after that unless there was some massive update or campaign DLC. But much to my surprise, that ended up not being the case. I actually kept coming back to Gran Turismo 7 for months. I finished the main campaign, started doing some of the special events and track experience trials, and have even done some of the bonus menus and new events that have been added to the game since its post-release patches. Even now, I still occasionally start jonesing to get behind the wheel for another race, even though I'm way out of practice and not as good as I was. And there's still a piece of me that wants to try the online multiplayer. So if you have been disappointed by Gran Turismo 7 and the lackluster effort that Polyphony has made to update and maintain the game, well, you have every right to be. It's a far cry from the glory days of Gran Turismo 3, but before you give up completely on the game, I urge you to try this one little thing before you drop the game entirely. Try steering the car with the motion controls. As I said in my blog review and the earlier video critique, I initially scoffed at the idea of motion steering when I first booted up the game and it was presented to me as an option. Motion controls have a poor track record, especially outside of the Wii. As a gimmick, they can work fine on occasion, but I've just never felt like they are precise enough to be a primary input method. But I had just bought a PS5, and I was still in the honeymoon period of trying out all the hardware's capabilities, so I said, why the heck not? And chose the motion steering option with the full expectation that I would race a few races, the motion steering would suck, and I would switch back to using the good old joystick. But that didn't happen. Yeah, there was an adjustment period. I had to get used to this radically different input method, but even when I was still figuring it out, the PS5 Dual Sense's motion controls proved surprisingly precise and responsive. The larger shape of the PS5 controller also makes it more comfortable to hold, and more closely maps to the typical 9 and 3 o'clock positions of the hands on a steering wheel. Sure, my index finger or middle fingers can get a bit crampy from holding down the gas and brake triggers. The controller is also a bit heavier than older PlayStation controllers, so my arms get a little stiff from holding it out in front of me, and occasionally I have to shake them out after a longer race or session. Nevertheless, I felt like I had much better control of the cars when using the entire controller as the steering input, rather than just the single thumbstick. With the motion steering, I can make much smoother motions while steering the cars, which, combined with the pressure-sensitive triggers for throttle and brake, allow me to perform maneuvers and techniques that I would never dream of trying with an analog stick. My turning is a lot smoother, my passing is a lot more graceful, I can hold the car steadier while drafting in a rival's slipstream, and the extra sense of control gives me the confidence to keep my car stable in a crowded position. Though, admittedly, I still frequently run into the back of the lead car when they decide to brake check me. No matter how many times it happens, I just can't get used to how early and how hard the AIs brake for a lot of these turns, and it has cost me so many more clean race bonuses than I can count. Regardless, the finer control with the motion steering really helps me to keep control in these crowded situations. Heck, even my straight line performance is improved with the motion steering. It's a lot easier to keep myself centered on the racing line while avoiding overcompensating or having to jerk the car back and forth to keep it on the line. Those hard, jerky movements were always a problem for me on the old games, even when using an analog stick. With analog controls on the stick, it's still hard to make small, precise movements with the stick to keep your car in a straight line. Like, it's hard to just tilt the stick by just a few degrees and then hold it, especially if you're already holding it a few degrees and just need to adjust it a few more degrees. Furthermore, with the PS5 Dual Sense's haptic feedback, the throttle and/or the brake triggers will stiffen and/or rumble if the car starts to slip or lose traction. I can actually feel myself losing control of the car and can ease off the throttle or the brake in order to prevent a skid or a spin and regain stability. In fact, feeling the stiffening of the throttle has been key to me learning how to manage my speed for the handful of rally events in the game. It's a shame that there aren't more events in rain and on wet roads or on rally circuits in order to take advantage of this particular feature of the controller. Motion steering just gives me so much more control over the vehicle, and the haptic feedback of the controller puts me more in touch with the car itself. The greater control makes sense from a body mechanics perspective. We generally have much finer and more precise movement in our wrists and whole arm than we do in just our thumb or any other single finger. This is why mouse and keyboard are universally preferred by aficionados of competitive shooters, why fighter enthusiasts generally prefer an arcade-style joystick, and why flight sim enthusiasts prefer a flight stick. And of course, it's also why racing enthusiasts prefer a racing wheel. It isn't just an aesthetic or immersion thing, nor is it just a mere gatekeeping symbol of dedication to the genre. You genuinely have more control moving a mouse or a joystick or a flight stick or a steering wheel with your entire hand or wrist or arm than you have while moving just a small thumbstick with just your thumb. For me, going from the thumbstick to the PS5 motion steering for Gran Turismo 7 was analogous to going from a gamepad to a mouse and keyboard for a first-person shooter. It is a genuine revelation and a paradigm shift for racing gaming. I'm honestly not sure if I can ever go back to playing a racing game or a driving game on a console with the gamepad thumbsticks again. But of course, this recommendation does come with several disclaimers. Obviously, if you already have an actual steering wheel controller, especially if it's one of the good ones, then switching to the regular gamepad's motion controls is almost certainly going to be a downgrade. But racing wheels are really friggin' expensive, and I'm not paying that much just for one racing game that I'm only going to be playing casually anyway. So for me, and those like me who don't have a racing wheel, the PS5 Dual Sense motion control is the next best thing. Also, I want to emphasize that I'm playing on the PS5 with Sony's first-party DualSense controller. There is a PS4 version of Gran Turismo 7 that plays with the old PS4 gamepads and wheels. I haven't played the PS4 version of the game, nor have I tried using any steering wheels or third-party controllers on the PS4 or PS5. Thus, I cannot vouch for how well the motion steering works on the PS4 version or with any third-party controllers for the PS5. If any of my viewers play the game on PS4, does that version support motion steering? If so, have you tried it? Is it any good? Please feel free to share your experience and opinions in the comments. I'd love to know if the PS4 motion sensor works even remotely as well as the PS5. I also haven't played with any of the wheel peripherals, so I don't actually know how the DualSense motion steering compares. I can only say that the DualSense motion steering is head and shoulders better than the thumbstick steering, and I can only assume that an actual racing wheel would be another order of magnitude better than the DualSense, but, that's just my assumption. Furthermore, I have so far only played single-player offline races. I have not played any online multiplayer at all. As such, I also cannot vouch for how well the motion sensor steering works in online matches. Maybe it introduces additional input latency, or maybe it works exactly the same as in offline single-player games. I don't know. If any of my viewers have experience with the motion steering on the PS4 or the PS5 in online multiplayer, I also invite you to share your experience in the comments and let the rest of us know how it goes. I will also admit that when I first started using the motion control steering, the default button layout wasn't really as comfortable for me as I would have liked. But luckily, Gran Turismo 7 has a fully configurable controller mapping. So when I realized that I wanted to stick with motion steering, I did some experimenting with custom button mappings, and I would feel remiss if I didn't also share my eventual preferred configuration with all of you, since I'm recommending the motion steering so highly. So here is the default button mapping for the motion steering on the PS5 version of Gran Turismo 7, and here is my custom button mapping. The most notable change from the default is that I moved gear shifting to the right stick. There were two reasons for this. One is that my general philosophy for mapping the buttons was to try to closely mimic the configuration of the controls in a real car, and to group game functions with other game functions that would normally be grouped together in a real car. Granted, a lot of modern sports cars do use paddle shifters, and so the shoulder buttons or triggers would simulate this just fine, but I'm old school, and I still think of the gear shifter as being in the center console. I live in the United States, which drives on the right side of the road, and so our driver's seats are on the left side of the car, and the gear shifter and emergency brake are in the console off of the driver's right hip. I may not be taking my right hand off the controller to reach down to manually shift a gear, but rotating my right hand a bit to roll my thumb over to the right stick is as close as I can get with just one gamepad. I also moved the free camera movement control to the left stick. This gives me a full range of motion for the camera if I ever need to turn and look at a blind spot, or if I need to check a particular gauge on the car's dash, or if I just want to admire the interior of the vehicle. You know, if Polyphony even bothered to model the interior of a given vehicle. The only other changes that I made from the default are pretty minor things, like I mapped the windshield wipers, horn, and flashing the high beams to the controller, all of which are supported by the game, but they're not mapped to any buttons by default. And while I was putting this video together and playing more of Gran Turismo 7 to collect footage for this video, I came across some other nags and frustrations in the post-campaign content that I want to rant about some more. So I might not be quite done with Gran Turismo 7 yet. I will probably do one more short rant video to get the rest of my major complaints out of my system, and then move on to other stuff. Then I will start working on other projects, including the next episode of How Madden Fails to Simulate Football. That next episode of that series will be a topic voted upon by my patrons, which will be the attribute ratings and evaluation, or lack thereof, for players on rosters. So stay tuned for that later in the spring. In the meantime, I have early draft scripts for content about Elden Ring, some Silent Hill related stuff, and I'm also considering doing something completely new by making a video about a tabletop board game. Ooh, exciting. These upcoming videos will be released early to patrons for a couple of weeks before being released to the broader public, so if you enjoy my content, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, and you'll be able to check out these videos early. Your support helps me to buy older games and other research material, helps me offset the cost of maintaining my blog, and prevents me from having to sell out and fill these videos with ads, sponsorships, and paid promotions. I lost a lot of supporters due to the financial stress during the COVID pandemic, so I really do appreciate those of you who have stuck around, and I offer my sincere thanks in advance to any future patrons. So yeah, that's how I've been playing Gran Turismo 7, and I encourage you to give it a try as well, unless, as I already said, you already have your own actual racing wheel, in which case, just keep using that. And I also hope that my custom button mapping is also more comfortable for some of you. Obviously, you can opt to use the default button mappings, or you can try your own custom mapping. And if you do come up with a custom button mapping that you think works better, then by all means, share that with us in the comments as well. It's such a damn shame that the actual campaign for this game is as limited and lackluster as it is, because Gran Turismo 7 is such a great racing game whenever you're behind the wheel. And it's so much better with the motion steering than with the default thumbstick. This driving simulation and this input method deserves to be in a better game. I really hope that Sony and Polyphony are able to eventually bring this game up to the standards of the classics in the series. And if not, hopefully Gran Turismo 8 will learn some valuable lessons from 7's failures and criticisms. And hopefully it will also have an equally responsive and comfortable motion steering method, because I don't think I can go back. Thanks for watching.